Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, which is entitled Mastering Information Governance, Taming SharePoint and Teams Sprawl, presented by Atlantis Solutions. Atlantis helps you to achieve your business objectives using Microsoft technologies. Whether you're looking to increase your competitive advantage and improve your maturity in your Microsoft environment, or you're just starting out in your Microsoft 365 journey, we're here to guide you. And today we have one of our valued partners joining us as well, which is Provision Point. Provision Point has one simple vision, which is to bring Microsoft 365 governance to life for all customers. Provision Point enables self-service governance, giving you control and peace of mind across the Microsoft platform. Before we get started, I just want to mention a couple of housekeeping items. So this session is being recorded. We'll share a copy of that with all attendees after the webinar, so you'll have that for your reference. There's also a little bit of time after the presentation to answer questions, so please put any questions or comments you have in the chat or in the Q&A functionality within Teams, and we'll get to as many of those as possible at the end of the presentation. There's also going to be a few polls throughout the webinar, and we would really love to see your answers. So please let us know your thoughts and we can understand what's important to you. So with that, let's get started. Today, we are going to share a little bit about best practices for managing information governance. We're going to discuss some real-world challenges and some success stories from our customers, and we're going to demonstrate how you can use governance in your Microsoft environment. To discuss these topics, I have with me two guests today. First of all, Andy Rowe, who is the Managing Director of Atlantis in the EMEA region. Andy has a broad range of successful project delivery globally, and he uses his diverse background in project delivery and operations to drive innovation and efficiency for organizations. I also have joining us today Peter Badley, who is Director of Microsoft 365 Strategy and Governance and the founder of Provision Point. Peter has over 15 years of experience delivering Microsoft solutions before he transitioned out of the server room and into the boardroom, where he now focuses on helping organizations deliver digital workspace solutions in the Microsoft Cloud. Thank you both for joining us today. We're excited to see this presentation on mastering governance, information governance, taming SharePoint and Teams sprawl. So let's get started. To kick us off, let's talk a little bit about content sprawl. So what is it and what challenges does it create for organizations?
Thank you, Amy. Thank you everyone for attending today. As Amy said, I'm Managing Director of Atlantis Solutions in the UK. My background has enabled me to experience working in a number of small businesses as well as medium and large enterprises in both private sector and public corporations operating on a global scale. So I've quite a lot of knowledge of these types of businesses. So for me, I cannot think of any business that doesn't in one way or another experience content sprawl. It manifests itself throughout industry, and it's often as a result of success, growth, and business tending to be focused, and rightfully so, on the future and the direction that they're heading. And content sprawl is not new. I'm going to talk a little bit about a time when offices were not full of network computers and central servers, and email was not what it is today. Computers were traditionally more a word processor, maybe some simple programming tools, and a device that enabled complex mathematical calculations to be performed quickly. So I'm going to talk about those sort of businesses, and I've used my wife's name, Tracy, as just the example. So Tracy's an entrepreneur, and she has a great idea for a business, and she makes the decision that the time is right to put her business idea into practice. She knows that driving the business is the most important thing to provide revenue, income, and they need the revenue to make the business work. And records management, although important, it effectively doesn't pay the bills. It doesn't make things happen. So Tracy sets up her office, she gets her desk and she gets her filing cabinet and starts her business. And she, like anybody, she sets up her own filing system with different sleeves named according to how the documents affect her and her daily tasks. And as with any file structure, it includes the inevitable not so sure folder, where everything that doesn't quite fit into the indexing system gets put. And I think we all have our own unique filing systems on our devices that we only understand the logic behind the reasoning. So Tracy's business does well, and with the increased demand, the business expands, employing more staff to help deliver the growth. And Tracy understands the importance of keeping records, but the immediate issue is to support the growth of her business. So new staff come in, they get their desks, they get their filing cabinets, they set up their own unique filing and index system ready to store records and start work. And then not so far distance into the future, the continued success of the build of the business, she looks out of her office one day and sees all these filing cabinets full of records and data, but quite frankly, only the person whose filing cabinet is really understand what's in there and why it's important and why it needs to be kept. Realising this, Tracy now decides to set up to get some control on the records, recognising that there's now business risks, unmanaged records, retention issues, findability of information, and as well as cost. I mean, having all these filing cabinets takes up valuable floor space where people could be sitting and things of that sort of nature. So Tracy makes the decision to centralise the records, cataloguing the files and bringing in an element of control. So she makes the decision to bring all the records and move them into a central location. A room that you control access to, making sure that information is stored safely in line with any regulatory requirements. And cataloguing is now defined for all these records going forward, so people have a solution. So we now have an element of control within our regulations. And if staff need to access records, they have to visit a records office manager, complete some paperwork, maybe seek approval to be able to retrieve documents requested. And of course, once the requested document is in the possession of the staff member, how can you control what happens to it? It's a pain having to go into the records management every time and retrieve a document and get the information out of it. So the natural thing for people to do is take the information, copy the information they need, just in case they need it in the future, and store that in their desk and return the original document. So now you have 2 copies of a document. And as soon as you have that copies being made, the element of control to a significant degree has now been eroded. And as the business continues to grow, the business has a records management policy in place. So all new records now have to meet a process which is controlled by the records management team. But what about the challenge of all the records that the staff have been storing locally for many years? Natural movement of resources through the business, projects come to an end, contracts expire. And how do you retrospectively go back and assess any document, review its purpose and catalogue its future requirements and things of that nature? And the records management team cannot possibly undertake that task. People try, but you can almost guarantee that the not so sure folder, where everything that doesn't fit into a policy gets put, will just grow exponentially as we move forward. And interestingly, I attended an event a few weeks ago, and one of the speakers talked about her records management journey. And although she didn't start the exercise, because it started in 2007, she explained that the business had in excess of 120 million documents that needed to be reviewed, categorised, digitised, and retention policies put in place. And she explained that it had taken over 20 years to complete, but they'd managed to reduce their records being kept by over 60%. But also in the process, they can now search and find any document quickly. But as you can imagine, just the technology changes in that time, let alone the business cycles that they'd had to overcome through that 20 years to get to this stage. So if we look at what we talked about just now, and we can see how content sprawl manifests into businesses, especially small to medium enterprises. Proliferation of salts, multiple filing cabinets in the scenario located at employees' desks, then into essential records, then into different business locations. Today, filing cabinets are replaced by SharePoint and other systems and multiple team sites and OneDrive and email, etc. And then the management of inconsistent data. Importance of documents will and does mean different things to different people, depending on their role in the organisation. So how do you categorise and therefore index information? You tend to apply conventions that enable you to operate efficiently. And it's just human nature, because it's you that's using the information, it's you that needs to find it. So you do it the way you want to do it. So using things like metadata to add common threads in line with policies, so people don't need to make up their own processes. You have a contract document that defines the requirements of a project. And within that document, the accounts department will be interested in, say, the cash flow and the payment terms. The delivery team will be interested in the project schedule as defined. Quality, health and safety and environment may be interested in the environmental information. So as you can see, that one document can contain multiple content streams, so people, by their nature, will keep information that is important to them and allows them to do their job. So personal data gets copied and stored for easy access by individuals. It's just the natural path that people take. So align a policy with proven standards. But you've got to make it usable, so people don't need to duplicate people. People can find what they need when they're searching for information. Poor naming convention, generally small and medium enterprises tend to be more delivery focused. Records management is extremely important, but to some, not at the detriment of the business being able to work efficiently. So there's an element of it's working and people are busy, so it must be okay without a policy. So set a naming convention so staff know how to save files, making finding content seamless, enabling them to do their business, their work efficiently. Lack of provisioning controls is another one. Resource in the business needs to be able to do a job. Provisioning how files and data is controlled is critical to business success. So provisioning controls should facilitate businesses to be successful and efficient while making sure that governance is adhered to. So how much control is effective but not restricted? Going to the records manager, checking out a document takes time and effort. Now you have the document, just copy the section you need. You can return the document and never have to go through that process again. So provisioning controls that are not effective just lead to proliferation of unused sites. And low adoption is another classic. When you work in a business, it's human nature to want to do the best for the business, being as efficient as you can and achieving great things. So restricting that ability leads to people seeking ways to get around things. And it's very rarely about people trying to find alternative routes to achieve an outcome, purposely to introduce risk to a business. It's more about people's nature to succeed. A scenario that I was involved in, not generally related to IT, but explains why people do what they do. When I worked on one of the biggest infrastructure projects in the UK some 20 years ago, and the construction workers actually preferred working the night shift. And the reasoning behind this was the safety teams during the day shift, monitoring safety practices and adherence to stringent safety policies, constricted people's ability to work efficiently. So much that at night there was a lot of safety people around, so it's much easier to get things done. So people found alternative ways to be efficient. I'm not saying it right, I'm not saying it's correct, but it is our nature to try and find quicker ways of doing things. So as we move on, we talk about consequences of content sprawl. So we had a client who've been working with now for some time, and the initial client request was for some help on a migration. But the first thing we did was we ran an assessment of the data estate, to see what information it had and how big this migration was going to be. And as you can see by the figures, we found they had 690 SharePoint sites, of which only 150 were active at any active. That's less than 25% of sites that were actually being used by anybody. Of 2.3 million files, only 10,000 were accessed within the last 12 months. Now that's not saying the other 2.29 million files were not used. People wouldn't access it, but they were sitting there ready, available for people to access. And of course, then you look at the size of the storage. All the files being stored and less than 0.5% have actually been used in the last 12 months. And when you look at this and the amount of storage and the files and the data and the information, the cost can be very prohibitive. As we move more into a hybrid storage model with cloud-based operations, how do we control the cost of all the storage and transactions? And according to a publication, The Data Center Dynamics, Microsoft since July 23 have increased its data center capacity by 500 megawatts, and there's currently 5 gigawatts of capacity at its disposal. And this will increase by a further 1 gigawatt in 2024 and a further 1.5 gigawatt in 2025. So as for the money, the investment in the UK alone is 3.16 billion US dollars. And to leverage that investment, Microsoft need consumers to be storing huge amounts of data. To put it in numbers, it's 1 trillion gigabytes of data they're going to have capacity for. So add to that the capacity of other major cloud storage suppliers, and you can do the maths. It's huge, and the investment needs to be paid for somewhere along the line with storage. As another side example, I'm currently working at how capacity increases exponentially, and people don't understand really why. I'm working with an engineering firm that uses an Excel spreadsheet to provide a quotation at the minute. And over the years, the business has grown and the data in the quotation spreadsheet has grown as projects have become more complicated. And they're a very successful business. But to now create a quote, even if it's a very small value quote, the system creates a 33 megabit file. And in most cases, the actual content and output of the quotation uses less than 1% of the capability of the sheet. So going back to usability, going back to cost, it's a file that isn't used but gets stored somewhere in some place. And as the proliferation of all the data becomes more prevalent and gets out there, security breaches, sensitive data are being out there, not knowing where it is, who has it, infringement of export licenses and data transferring across borders. I'm sure we've all sent information to people in other countries. Do we understand export controls? Do we know about export controls? Do we know how those things work? Do we know what could happen if something went wrong? And identical data at the minute in the UK and globally is quite important as more and more information about individuals is found. And in the UK, if you have an infringement and the rights of individuals are broken, the fines can be up to 4% of annual global turnover, or £17.5 million, whichever is greater. So the fines for not doing this can be absolutely huge. And it's not only costs that are measurable that are not so tangible, but with the consequences. People struggle to find information. And as they struggle to find information, they either recreate information or they find it more difficult to do their job. Employees spend a lot of time in non-productive time during the week due to the poor collaboration and how things are set up. Leaders in IT struggle with controlling data and controlling where that information goes because they can't restrict the business and the role that the business does every day, but they have to be in control of what's going in and out of the businesses. So to summarise, that's a brief introduction of how content sprawl comes. And I want to summarise with content sprawl is not new. It's probably been around since the Industrial Revolution. So it's been around a long time. Management of records has real consequences. Data breaches, fines, productivity and efficiency all play a part in management of records. And cost. Yeah, there is a cost to implementing a robust but usable record governance policy, but the costs but the cost can be infinite if you don't do it. And there are great tools out there which address possibly all your requirements and concerns. And the last thing is you're not alone. You're not the first and certainly won't be the last. And so we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. Thank you. Hand over to Peter.
Yeah, thanks, Andy, for highlighting those challenges. Turning to Peter, thinking about how AI is changing the way we work, how we interact with documents and records. Some of the clients we speak to are thinking about AI can be some kind of silver bullet that's going to resolve these challenges with findability and archival and disposition of records, while others are quite concerned about the security and privacy implications. So how do you see AI playing into the governance equation and the records management equation?
So I think, firstly, thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for attending. I think the one thing I would say about AI is it's truthful. It's truthful based on your data. So if your data is in great shape, if it's well organized, if it's well structured, if old data is archived, if it's correctly secured, then AI will give you the results which you expect it to do and you want it to do. The risk associated with AI and what gets a lot of people concerned is that their data is unstructured. They've got sprawl. There are out of date documentations. There's out of date policies. Personal data is available. The CEO's salary is available to search because people haven't archived the data properly. They've got unstructured data. They've got permissions scattered around their environment. And so day to day, people might not see that data, but AI can surface that data. And so from a governance perspective, it's no different than any other solution and any other way of working with our data. It's just that AI can surface that data, which represents more of a risk to organizations.
Great. Yeah, thank you for sharing that perspective. So when we think about governance, like this is a word that's thrown around a lot. So what does governance really mean in this context?
Yeah, so I think governance falls into three key areas. Often we only assume governance is the first one, which is the operational assurance, which is more of the IT technical elements, ensuring devices and platforms and other things like that are secured correctly. So I definitely think that's one part of our governance. The second part is more around information assurance. That's really our data, understanding the life cycle of our files, understanding the life cycle and regulatory restrictions which we operate under. How long do we need to retain data for? What should we do with it once it reaches that end of retention period? So understanding our data and information and how that should be governed correctly. And then the third element is outcome orientated. So that's more about ultimately the delivery of that governance and the people which surround that. So making sure that people understand the processes, understand the rules about governance, understand how to use the tools correctly. I think just a couple of really quick points related to that. Our poll which we took, I think actually the adoption was one of the big things which came up. And also Andy talked about that classic example of people at a construction site liking to work in the evenings and overnight because there was less control. And we see that the same with IT and IT services in the cloud. People will often resort to using something outside of the IT network, ungoverned, uncontrolled, because it's perceived as quick and easy. So we have to make sure that when we're delivering governance as an organization, we engage our users, we ensure we understand our information and our regulatory requirements to secure, retain, dispose of that data, and we implement the right IT infrastructure around that for our operational assurance. So this is an interesting one. So governance does vary per organization. There's lots, especially in the Microsoft 365 space. I'm hoping that everyone on this webinar today will resonate with at least one of these points, whether that's having too many teams, users can easily request stuff and we end up with sprawl. They need to ensure that content is retained or personal data is correctly secure, or that actually managing external users is a problem. It might be all five of these. I find, or a couple of others. I tend to find organizations when they're looking at governance are really focused on 2 or 3 key things. And so thinking about what those key challenges are helps you get the most out of governance and deliver it effectively on Microsoft 365. Thinking about how you then go and implement that and what the best practices are in a Microsoft world and thinking in the Microsoft 365 ecosystem, I think there's 4 key things you need to think about. Firstly, labeling of data. So labeling your sensitive data correctly, That will ensure that it is controlled correctly. That's the advantage of using the Microsoft 365 platform and sensitivity labels. It will stop personal data being shared externally. It will stop commercially sensitive data being shared with the wrong people. We then support that with retention policies and retention labels to actually control, actually, this data does need to be retained for 5 years, 7 years, 10 years before it's effectively disposed of. Whereas other data, which is more transient, maybe more project orientated and doesn't need a longer retention period, that's appropriately disposed of. We then support that with our lifecycle policies to ensure that you actually go ahead and archive the data at the right time. So retain and then dispose with our lifecycle. And then finally, you need to think about ongoing compliance. So when you're managing data and you've set up these rules, you've set up this retention, you've set up these lifecycle policies, you've set up how data should be secured, you need to make sure that that's being complied with from a regulatory compliance reason. You need to be able to report that. So that's another really important element. I won't dwell too long on this slide, but just to call out some of the common things you need to think about when you're dealing with self-service, dealing with governance in Microsoft 365. One of those is self-service. So the common challenge of, do you let your users create all of your SharePoint sites, all of your teams, or do they have to send a ticket through to IT and get frustrated that it takes 2 or 3 days to get actioned? We'll talk a little bit about that in a second in the demonstration. Other ones, naming policies. Andy mentioned that. One of the biggest challenges with Sprawl is people just don't know what stuff is for. So actually naming sites and teams effectively so people can understand its purpose, maybe using organizational metadata as part of that. And then finally, there's a lot of items on here about external access. So we could talk for an entire webinar just about external access, but how you manage your guest users, how you manage your sharing links. It's one of the most common issues around Sprawl. Organizations just don't know who has access externally to what, and whether those people should be blocked from having access.
Yeah, thanks for sharing those tips. Looking at our polls, one of the top challenges that people responded is user adoption and training. And I think that really ties to this next point, which is, thinking about these different Microsoft applications, users are not always clear on, when is it best to use OneDrive versus Teams versus SharePoint, and how do these apps interplay for different business functions?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the challenge is you can use them all to some extent in the same way. You can store files in all of these items. Retention labels can be applied, workflows can be applied, collaboration files can be shared from all of these locations. I like to think about a few simple rules with these. So in my world and the way I think about governance and implementation of Microsoft 365, OneDrive is for personal or draft content. So if you're working on something individually to share in the future, or something which is only specific to you as a function, that's the role for OneDrive. You can leverage the move to functionality within OneDrive to move it to the correct place when you need to get a broader audience interacting with that file. Teams is great. We all use Teams day to day, but I think Teams is still a temporary place. It's for information which ultimately has a life cycle. It's a project, it's a collaboration, it's a product launch, it's a marketing campaign. It's somewhere where we can work on something, we can pull in both internal and external users to collaborate, and at some point that collaboration will end. SharePoint, on the other hand, is our longer term location for information. It's where we manage our core documents for a long time, our policies, our procedures. It's where we manage our intranet information and our business knowledge. It's a permanent record, which may well then have retention policies and associated with it to ensure that that content is effectively retained.
Great. So now that we've kind of looked at the challenges and why governance is important, let's talk a bit about how a governance solution can complement Microsoft 365's capabilities.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to be doing a demonstration shortly of the Provision Point application. When I talk about that and when I demonstrate it, I'm going to focus on 4 key areas. The first of which is workspace provisioning. It's a little bit of a technical term, but it's essentially that self-service element. It's the bit in alternative to either everyone creates everything or it has to go through IT. So it's self-service abilities to create teams and sites and groups, but with rules, with approval, with controls. The second element is lifecycle. So that's allowing us to control the sprawl of either new sites and teams or existing sites and teams, moving through a multi-stage process to manage retention and disposal of those workspaces at an appropriate time. And then the other two key pillars are compliance. So we talked about that a little bit earlier. How can we automate regular compliance, regular checks, and take action on key risks like orphan teams, teams without active owners, oversharing of information, unused teams. And then how do we support that with point-in-time audit reporting? So how can we understand the risks and health issues of your tenant? How can we understand where there might be cost savings as well around things like storage or licensing or other key areas of optimization? So I think we'll give people just a few 30 seconds or so to answer the poll, and then I'm going to switch over to a demonstration so that people can see a little bit of the product in action.
Perfect. Yeah, why don't you go ahead and share your screen?
Okay. If you could just confirm, Amy, you can see that okay? So I'm confident everyone can see it.
Yeah, you bet. Go ahead.
Okay, perfect. So it's just going to be a quick demonstration today of the provisioning capabilities, and then I'll show some of the lifecycle and compliance capabilities as well. I'm going to use two users for my demonstration today, the first of which is Adele. She represents one of my end users. The Provision Point app is available in a couple of experiences. You can access it through the web browser. You can also access it as a built-in Teams app as well. As a user, I can come in and make those self-service requests for new sites and teams. You see, I've got different templates here. These templates might allow me to control things like how that team is going to be labeled with a sensitivity label, how it's going to be secured from privacy and guest access perspective. You know, I can't, some of these I can change. Some of these options I can't change. These are constraints which my organization have put in place for me. If I'm creating a new team here, let's say I'm creating one for managing our HR policies, and I want to put in some information. I want to capture additional metadata about what I'm requesting. So that extra data which helps control our naming and other elements of our site and team which gets created. So this could be drop-down choices, text fields, even using your organizational taxonomy. I can also put rules in place to ensure that I've got a minimum number of owners, so that I need to have at least 2 people managing it, helping me to manage that risk associated with someone leaving my organization and that it's no longer managing that team effectively. Now, if I go ahead and request this team, you'll see here that my request is pending approval. So I've still got some organizational control. And as a administrator, I'll just move over as an admin or an approving user here, in this case, Megan. I can see that an approval task has been assigned to me. So I will receive an email notification within the app, and I can also go in and review that task, action it, and choose to approve or reject it. Examples of approval might be going to a user's manager, or to a specific group of users, maybe the compliance or IT help desk team. And we can have multiple stages of approval to manage that process. We can also apply policies to it. So we can see here that this team is creating, but let's go and actually have a look at a team which recently created. So this one here for finance upgrade project. If I drill into that within the Provision Point application, I can see a lot of information about it. I can see how it's been secured. I can see this policy applied to it. That's going to control the expiry. So in this case, it's going to expire in 51 days, unless one of the owners choose to take some action. And so, for example, I can come in here and I can extend that lifecycle period for a longer period of time. I can also see the steps which are going to happen as part of my lifecycle. So I can see that it's going to move through a configurable multi-stage expiry process to initially archive the team and then delete it. There are other triggers which we can use for these lifecycle actions, such as the team's not being used. So if the team is not being actively used, that can trigger an expiry process. And we can see that here with different policies which are running against this team. So in this case, it's compliant with our external sharing policy. It's compliant because it's not got any owners which have left the organization. but it's been identified as inactive. And as an administrator, I can actually manage this centrally. So I can go in and view my different sites and teams, which potentially are compliant or non-compliant, and anything in grey is potentially an issue around it. So I can go in here and I can see in this case it was non-compliant because it hasn't been modified in over a month. That might drive a life cycle process, or that might just drive reporting to me as an organization. There are other types of reports which I can run. I can also look at key dashboards to understand how my environment is broken down, such as sites versus teams, and also where information is secured or shared externally. So here I can go in and see, here are all my sites and teams which are externally shared via guests, and I can export this data if I need it for compliance and auditing purposes. Finally, I can drill down as an administrator and do further reporting at the user and storage level. So I can report on guest users, sharing links, storage, orphaned users, and I can run these reports across my environment to understand where there are workspaces which are shared externally. So let's have a look at this one. So I ran this a little bit earlier, and I can see my sharing links across my environment. Anyone who knows Microsoft 365 will know that that can take hours or days to produce. And again, I can export this report, or I can take action on it to manage those sharing elements and identify risks and control them. And that's really what Provision Point is all about. If I just return to my end user, Adele, for a second, I have created my team here. Look at how it's named. It's used my data, which I provided to control the naming convention. And inside of Teams, my new team has been created. And that includes some default structures. So it's got some default channels in there. I can include default apps and default structures, including lists and libraries, folders within my environment. So Provision Point will help you with that provisioning element with templates. It will help you with policies to control both the compliance and the life cycle, and then auditing to drill down into those individual risks. I'm going to stop sharing and return to you, Amy, so we've just got a few minutes to wrap up the slides today.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for sharing that demo. Perhaps you could also share a little bit about how some customers are using Provision Point.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to share this case study, which was for Transport for London. I'm sure probably most of you are familiar with them. They run the tubes and the buses in London, and they were going through a migration to the Microsoft Cloud. They created thousands or had thousands of SharePoint sites, and they were really struggling with Sprawl. They were struggling with how information is being secured. They were struggling with how data should be archived. Which data should be archived as well. So using Provision Point, they were able to implement expiry policies to control the expiry of those sites and teams. They were able to effectively assign owners to those sites and teams, and they were able to manage the process of new sites and teams through that self-service creation. They started with SharePoint sites, so I think they started with around 14,000 SharePoint sites they were managing using Provision Point, and they've recently, in the last 12 months, also rolled that out for Teams as well.
Fantastic. That's a great example. So just in kind of our conclusion setting here, I want to focus on some of the practical aspects. So let's talk about how an organization can get started with governance. We touched on a little bit, resistance to change and lack of user adoption is often one of the challenges that organizations face. So perhaps you guys can share a little bit about how we can manage that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll hand it to Andy to start us off.
Yeah, sorry. So driving adoption. I guess one of the main things to do with any business is you need to take your teams on the journey. You need to understand that the change is hard for people. So to get people to collaborate and understand why they're doing and adopt the policies, you've got to emphasize why this is happening. What's the requirements? Why do you need to do it? Why is it important? And what are the consequences of not doing it? And that helps people understand and buy into the plan. And then once you've got that information, create a system that allows you to measure the successes. Success is the most important thing. And people like to see things that they're doing, and when they see they're doing and it's driving a successful regime, people like to celebrate that sort of thing and listen to the concerns. Change is hard. It's hard for people to adopt. We've done the same thing for 10 years. Why on earth would we change something now? But regulations do change. Things do happen. Things do occur. Following on from once you've decided and you've worked out how you're going to deliver this, look at how the training is going to be done. Training people is key to any success, and people train at different speeds and different ways. So try and find the best policies that allow you to train those people, but reinforce it. Adoption has to happen. It's not a choice. So emphasize why, understand why, explain scenarios why if we don't adopt these policies, things can happen inside the business that will have a real detrimental effect if we don't follow certain rules and regulations. And as you go on this journey, you're going to create lots of information about it. So set a wiki site up. So set style pages. Get best practices in place, and have a site where people can go and look at information and find information about what they're doing and why they're trying to do things. It's really important that for me, all the while, is taking your staff on the journey with you, because if you don't, pushback is horrendous. And one of the keys that we found is, great Microsoft 365 champion. Sounds obvious. Of course, it always sounds obvious. But you want someone within the teams of the various departments to understand why we're doing what we're doing and help them engage with their teams, help them navigate the challenges that they're going to have. Not every policy is going to fit with everyone.
Yeah, thank you for sharing those tips. Those are really helpful. Maybe we can also talk a little bit about what a journey towards governance maturity looks like.
Yeah, I think this can be quite quick. I mean, we've talked about it from throughout the webinar. Assessing and planning. What we did with one of our customers, do an assessment of what they're doing first of all, understand what they're trying to achieve. Peter mentioned it. What are you trying to achieve out of what you're doing? Once you've got that, work on what results look like and what success looks like and how you're going to get there. And then when you've done that, bring your teams in, bring the stakeholders in so they can help define the policies and make those policies happen. And then secondly, moving on to the implementation phase, don't do a big bang theory. Take a team that needs to adopt something first. Let them work their way through it. Let them understand why it's doing it. Let them find the pitfalls, because you will have to change direction as you move along this journey. It's whatever you put on day one is never going to be the result at the end of it. And then you move on once you've got the first team working and it seems to be okay and people are adopting it and the training seems to be good. Optimize the scaling. Move on to optimizing the business and rolling it out to the rest of the business. And of course, the final part of it, which is never the final part, is continuously monitoring and maintaining it. How do you measure the success and broadcast the success? If you've got reduced your number of files by half and you've saved, millions of pounds of money, celebrate those successes with the teams to make them feel part of it. I think because we are sort of running out of time, I just want to finish on one statement before we close it out. We work with a local authority in Canada, and one of the managers has been there for some 20 plus years, so they're quite high up in this local authority. And he said to us, if he does a search on his name on his PC, up pops his resignation letter when he was a part-time lifeguard during his college years when he was 16. That information has been maintained for 20, 25 years for absolutely no reason whatsoever. And there are hundreds and thousands of these documents everywhere. Thank you, Amy.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. What an interesting example. And we really appreciate those tips that you shared, and to you as well, Peter. We have a few questions from the audience. So perhaps for Peter, how does Provision Point work with the existing capabilities of Microsoft 365 and Purview that do provide some governance capabilities?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So if you've already got some of those capabilities, maybe with an E5 license or Azure Premium or other things like that, you can still use Provision Point. Provision Point will enhance and complement those features. So it will leverage things like sensitivity labels and retention labels, which you are already configured. It will also potentially give you a bit more configurability than those native options exist. So instead of one rule for all of your SharePoint sites and teams, Provision Point can give you the granularity to implement different types of rules for different data. Equally, if you don't have those capabilities yet, if you're not using all of those capabilities, you're not licensed for those capabilities, then you can continue to use Provision Point. Provision Point doesn't have any base level restrictions. You'll still be able to do provisioning. You'll still be able to apply lifecycle policies.
Great, thanks for answering that. And what does a typical project engagement look like? For example, how long would that take? How would a customer engage?
Yeah, so I would say a typical deployment of Provision Point as a product. So step two in Andy's example, dependent on the organization size, is typically somewhere in the region of 6 to 8 weeks of elapsed time. Maybe a bit longer for larger clients like Transport for London, but somewhere in that sort of range. But it's actually the piece before that, that's step one, where you need to do the assessment, you need to do the definition, just define what you're going to do. Some organizations will be really well prepared for that. Other organizations need to do a lot more work on that. So that might then turn a project into a sort of 3 to 6 months project to ensure the necessary discovery, deployment of the tools, and then actually adoption of the tools. And I think that's a bare minimum before you start to see results. And as Andy says, you then need to continue to evolve and iterate from that, and don't try and do everything at once.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And do you have any more examples of customer successes where maybe data needed to be cleaned up and governance really needed to be implemented?
Yeah, I think it depends on the industry you work in. So we see different requirements and different drivers for governance and implementation of Provision Point dependent on the industry. So to give a couple of really quick examples, one of which is government. We work with a lot of government clients all over the world, in North America and in Europe, where they have specific requirements. A lot of that's focused on data retention and data compliance. So in those scenarios, you're much more focused on ensuring that data is labeled correctly and data is retained and disposed of in an accurate manner to actually meet those legal requirements. Another common example is organizations in an education setting. The challenge for them is they're just dealing with so much volume, so many sites and teams created, so many external users created. So Provision Point in those scenarios has helped organizations with very specific time sensitive creation of sites and teams. You're starting a new year or a new semester, and you've suddenly got to create 2,000 teams in a very quick manner and ensure that those are correctly secured. And then also dispose or archive a lot of sites and teams which are no longer relevant because that term period or year has now finished.
Thank you for sharing those. I think that's all the time we have for today. So thank you both so much for joining and sharing your insights on managing governance in Microsoft 365. Of course, for our audience, if you do have any additional questions, we'd be happy to discuss them further with you. We would be happy to have a call to discuss this with one of our Microsoft 365 experts. We're also offering today for our webinar attendees a free governance assessment for Microsoft 365. This is a no commitment assessment. We will meet with you for about an hour, and from this assessment, you'll receive a governance scorecard that will help you to really identify areas for improvement and create a plan so that you can continue maturing your approach to Microsoft governance. There should be a link coming up in the chat to book a call if you're interested in getting your scorecard for governance and creating an actionable plan for next steps. I'd also like to mention Elantis's next webinar, which will be on July 18th. This webinar is all about Microsoft Copilot, certainly a topic that many people are talking about. So we'll cover what Copilot is, what it's not, and how you can use it to help yourself and your organization. We'll also have a link in the chat to register for that one so you can get it in your calendar. After this webinar, we will share a recording of the entire session, along with some more information about our upcoming events and about Provision Point and Elantis. You can also visit elantis.com/events, follow us on social media, and subscribe to our newsletter to stay up to date on technology trends and make sure you don't miss any of our upcoming events. Thank you everyone for attending, and especially to Andy and Peter for presenting today. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you.